here this morning on this beautiful day before Christmas Eve. And hey, find somebody next to you. It is cold and flu season, so just give them like an elbow five or like maybe a pat on the back, something. Just let them know that you're glad that they are here today. All right, you can have a seat. Thank you so very much. Well, we are glad you're here. My name is Charles. I am the lead pastor here at the church at Estrella. And maybe my wife will make it in a minute, maybe not. It seems like we've got everybody running just a little bit late today. That's what happens when you get closer to Christmas break, right? Everybody likes to sleep in those extra like 5 minutes. Or this morning, I think we hit the alarm 3 times on our way in. So I think everybody else is just a little bit like us today as it's coming. So hey, I am excited though that you are here. On your seat, there should have been a welcome card. Take a moment, fill that out. Just lets us know that you're here. If you're a first-time guest, then this is all we're going to ask of you for out of everything that we do today is that you would just give us this back at the very end of the service. We use that just to simply a simple text and just say, hey, thank you guys so much for coming and choosing to worship with us today. Speaking of worship, I'm super excited because tomorrow night we have our first ever Christmas Eve service. We did one last year, kind of small scale, didn't really invite a whole lot of people. It was kind of like our, dip our toes in the water because we hadn't even really been around for very long. We were still doing what we call preview services. And so this is our first one. It's going to be amazing. Ryan, I'm glad Ryan's here. Ryan's not playing with us today. He's been playing with us the last couple weeks, but he'll be there tomorrow night, banging it out on the electric guitar. We have one of the best violin players in the entire Phoenix Valley area that's going to be here to help lead with some of those carols. And if you've never sang carols with somebody on a violin, it is beautiful, absolutely beautiful. So you want to make sure that you're here for that. Not only that, but we're going to be giving away something very special tomorrow. So our 1-year birthday party is coming up, and tomorrow night we have tickets for that party that have a 50% off coupon for the food trucks that will be here on January the 13th. We'll be having a big party. We'll have balloons, we'll have inflatables, we'll have food trucks here. And if you're here tomorrow night, we're going to have some coupons for that. And you are welcome to take 2 or 3 of those so that you can hand them out to a friend, right? Because there's nothing better than you invite somebody to be like, wait. I have something to sweeten the deal even more. Not only is it going to be amazing, but I can get you 50% off the food trucks. Whatever food truck is there, you just turn it in, and whatever one you want, and it'll give you 50% off. So be here tomorrow night to get that. We'll have a couple of them on the seats. And if you're like, oh, I have more friends that I wanted to invite, I might be able to work a deal to get you a couple more than the 3 that we're sitting out. All right? So that's going to be a lot of fun. The next couple of weeks, though, starting next Sunday, we have a brand new series, and I'm actually not teaching it. I know. Caleb is going to teach on the 30th and January 6th. So he's going to teach a 2-week series, and it's called Pursuit. And he's got a little trailer video he wants you to watch as we see it. looking forward to that. Caleb's going to bring 2 weeks in a row of that series, and so it'll be different. And oh, you'll have to hit stop on it back there. Sorry. Sometimes it loops for me. You know, I like that effect on stuff. But today, I am going to finish up our Xmas Dilemma series that we've been in for the last couple of weeks. And we're going to look at one of, I think, the most interesting and perhaps even controversial characters in the Christmas story. So I'm not going to tell you about who it is or what it is right this second, but I am looking forward to his story. And speaking of things today, if you didn't already know, at the end of service, we have a special guest who's coming. All right, and he'll be at the back to take pictures with you and your family. And so you don't have to have kids to get a picture with Santa Claus. All right, so make sure that you get back there, and maybe you have that one last thing that you've been waiting to tell him. You know, maybe your kids need that one last reminder about how to survive tomorrow, right? So, just saying. This is that moment, and so excited that he could come and stop in, and he'll be here to take pictures. Let me pray for us, and then we'll continue on in some God-honoring worship. Father, I just give you all of the glory and the honor for who it is that you are. God, we are so blessed to be able to come into your presence and to celebrate your Son, Jesus. God, what an amazing time of the year it is, as we, even though there's lights and pretty things all over the place, but God, we get an opportunity to just focus our attention straight on the most amazing thing that you ever sent, the most amazing gift that was ever given to us, and that was your Son, Jesus. God, I pray that right now as we continue to come into your presence, Father, that we would just worship you, that the words from our lips and our mouths would be a sweet sound, and that it would be pleasing to your heart. Just give you all of the glory and the honor in your name. Amen.
In the bleak winter, all creation groans, for the world in darkness, frozen like a stone. Light is breaking in a stable for a throne. He shall reign forevermore, forevermore. Forevermore, forevermore. Unto us a child is born, the King of kings and Lord of lords, and he shall reign forevermore, forevermore. If I were a wise man, I would travel far. If I were a shepherd, I would do my part. For as I am, I will give to him my heart. And he shall reign forevermore, forevermore. Starry skies, this baby born for sacrifice, Christ the Messiah. To our hopes and to our fears, the Savior of the world appears, the promise of eternal years, Christ the Messiah, and he shall reign forevermore, forevermore. King of kings and Lord of lords, and he shall reign forevermore, forevermore, forevermore. You probably know the tune to this song. Your pastor rewrote the lyrics. Very cool. Sing along. You were the child born in the manger, sent from God the Lord Most High. The Holy One called Emmanuel, born to bridge the gap for me. What a beautiful name it is. What a beautiful name it is. The name of Jesus Christ, my King. What a beautiful name it is. Nothing compares to this. What a beautiful name it is. The name of Jesus. Wise men came to find you, seeking the greatest gift of all. The angels sing of your arrival, good news of great joy for all mankind. What a wonderful name it is. What a wonderful name it is. The name of Jesus Christ, my King. What a wonderful name it is. Nothing compares to this. What a wonderful name it is. The name of Jesus. What a wonderful name it is. The name of Jesus. Gifts sent from heaven, child in a manger, the hope of the world, the gift for all. Heavens are roaring, praise of your glory, Messiah the Savior of the world. You have no rival, you have no equal, now and forever, God, you reign. Yours is the kingdom, yours is the glory, yours is the name above Times are bending low, roots all among the climbing way, with painful steps and slow. Look now, the glad and golden hours come swiftly on the wing. Rest beside the weary road and hear the angels sing. And hear the angels sing. And hear the angels sing. Lord God, we thank you so much for your birthday. And we thank you that it is one day before Christmas Eve. And Lord, we pray that tonight, this morning, that you would speak through Pastor Charles, and that you would speak a word that would change our lives forever. In Jesus' name, amen.
Tonight, the Black Friday frenzy is already in overdrive. As of 10 o'clock this Thanksgiving morning, consumers spent $406 million online, up a striking 23% from last year.
Well, welcome back. Glad you guys are here for what will be our final week of the Xmas Dilemma. Hey, it's been really interesting. I don't know if it has been for you, but it certainly has been for me to look at these very real people. Sometimes I think we've told these stories so often that we have felt like Mary and Joseph and the baby were some sort of like fairy tale story, but they were real people who had some very real problems. And hopefully you felt like as we've gone through this that their problems, you felt the weight of the dilemmas that they faced as Jesus came into the world. And I love that each of their stories has had a direct application to our lives. Mary's favor that she was given by God showed us that you and I have the same kind of favor given to us because Jesus was given into the world. We have Joseph, who had the opportunity to adopt Jesus into his own family and to acknowledge him as the Messiah. And he got to be included in God's story for all eternity because of that. Today we have one more character that we're going to look at. And they're quite a character. In fact, they may be one of the most controversial of all characters as a part of the Christmas story. So if you have your Bibles, open them up with me to the book of Matthew. Matthew chapter 2. And we're going to read verses 1 through 18. Right? And actually, we're going to clip a little bit in between, so just kind of do your best to follow along with me, and we'll put it up on the screen as well. So let's look together, starting in verse 1. It says, "Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, 'Where is he who was born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose, and we've come to worship him.' And when Herod the king heard this, he was greatly troubled, and all of Jerusalem was troubled with him. And assembling all of the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them. He said, 'Where is the Christ to be born?' And they told him, 'In Bethlehem of Judea,' because it was written that way by the prophet." Slide down to verse 7. It said, "Then Herod summoned the wise men He did so in secret, and he ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go, search diligently for the child, and when you found him, would you bring me back word so that I too could come and worship him?" And after listening to the king, they went on their way. Verse 16. It says, "Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he became furious, and he sent and he killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under, because that was according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. And this was fulfilled just as what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah." Let's pray. God, I think you have an incredibly important message for us today. And while few of us want to admit it, I think that the character that we're going to look at, a lot of us can relate with him. And have been there and have had moments like that. Maybe we're even struggling with that as we come into this Christmas. Father, I pray right now that you would clear out all of the distractions. Father, that you would use your word like an arrow that pierces straight to the heart. God, shape us, mold us, and make us more like what you want us to be. It's in your precious and holy name we pray. Amen. Okay, first of all, there's a lot in this text. All right? A lot in this text. And so here's what I'm going to promise to you right now. I promise I'm going to come back to this text again next year. All right? Some of you caught the joke. Look, there's only a couple of Christmas texts. I promise we're going to preach it almost every year. But this text is very important, and it has some amazing characters in the birth narrative of who Jesus is. But you know what's amazing? None of these people were actually there at the birth of Jesus. Right? You have the wise men who come, and while we don't really know, we ascertain, because of what the text tells us, that they were as much as maybe 2 years after Jesus was born. When it says to us that Herod goes and kills all those that were 2 and under, it's because that's when the star first appeared and they started following it. So Jesus could have been as old as 2 years old when the wise men got there. Well, Herod, he wasn't there. He didn't even know a baby had been born. He was still in his palace. And then you have the scribes and the chief priests, right? They didn't know that this baby had been born. They should have probably known that the baby had been born. I mean, how in the world did they miss the signs and the wonders that came along with it? How did they miss what all the scriptures had taught them about this time coming? They had. And each of these people had an incredible dilemma, right? First, you have the wise men. And these wise men and their dilemma was about searching for this newborn baby. And they have come into the city of Jerusalem, and they have walked into Herod's palace seeking this newborn king of the Jews. Herod was king of the Jews. And so they assumed that it was his new son that had been born. And they began to ask about it. And all of a sudden they realize, oh, this is not where it's at. This is not where the star was leading us to. And we don't really know where we're supposed to go, but it's not here. It's not now. So they have a dilemma on their hands about what it is that they're going to do. Then you have the chief scribes, right? And all of the priests that were there. Because their dilemma is, how did they miss this? Are their lives at stake now? Because the king is about to be furious that they didn't inform him about what was about to take place. Maybe they're not the prophets that they should have been. But then you have Herod. Herod's who we're going to talk about today. Now, Herod may be one of the most hated men in all of biblical history. Perhaps second to maybe only his son, Herod, who crucified Jesus. And Herod made a decision. Let's talk about his decision before we even get to his dilemma. His decision was to kill all of the babies that were 2 years and under. in all of Bethlehem and the area around. Now, historians struggle with this. There's not a lot of record about this having taken place. And the reason is that Bethlehem was not a very large town. So you're talking about maybe 20 or 30 babies that would have been killed. Don't get me wrong, that's still an atrocity. But what would drive somebody to kill 30 innocent baby boys? What kind of a dilemma would possibly bring that about? That's where we're going to focus today. Now, to be honest, this is not the first time in biblical history that we've seen babies be killed. Nearly 1,000 years before this point, Pharaoh in Egypt killed all of the babies of the Jewish families. He did so as a population control and as a strength control measure to keep them from outgrowing and outpacing and taking over his country. So it's not the first time we've seen this in biblical history. Now, Herod, though, had a whole different reason for why he was doing this. Now, much of Herod's story is not told to us in the Bible, right? Because Herod falls into this period of time that's called the intertestamental or deuterocanonical period, right? Those are really, really big words. So I put them up on the screen to help us out, okay? So the intertestamental period is the about 400 years between the book of Malachi and the book of Matthew. Actually, to be honest, it's the events of the book of Matthew. So Malachi finishes up somewhere around 420 BC, and then Jesus comes onto the scene, most people think somewhere between 4 and 6 BC. Not 0. Sorry to burst all your bubbles. The guy who put the calendar together back in the 1500s missed a couple of days along the way. He got a little bit off in his calculations, and so we don't have Jesus born in 0 like we all think of him as being, but he's probably closer to 4 to 6 BC, somewhere in there. So not only, Herod's story is not recorded in the Bible. It's actually given to us from a whole bunch of extra sources. And they could turn Herod's story into one of the most fantastic series that you've ever seen. If you've watched Game of Thrones, or if you've watched like The Tudors, or if you've watched any of like Elizabeth, or any of those like documentaries that like HBO, BBC, and all of those do about these families who are battling over the thrones, I'm telling you, Herod's family's story could make an incredible series. Well, let's just back up and let's look at it a little bit. So this area, the area is called Idumea, right? And Idumea, you don't really know where that's at, so I've got a little map to help us out. And Idumea is down there in the box. And it was a critical piece. Everybody who was any sort of conquering empire would go right through this stretch of land because it was the only north-south landway to get down into Africa. It was the only east-west route to be able to connect what was Europe and what was Asia. So it's this critical piece of land. And so over and over again, this area of Idumea was conquered by empires, starting with the Babylonians. And then you have the Assyrians and the Syrians. Those are two different peoples, by the way, the Assyrians and the Syrians. And then you even have the Persians who come through and conquer this area. And of course, one of everybody's favorites, Alexander the Great, right? The Grecian conqueror who conquered most of the known world. He went right through Idumea. And so it probably shouldn't come as much surprise to you that the Romans, and a couple of famous guys from the Romans, as a matter of fact, you've probably heard the names Julius Caesar and Pompey. In 63 BC, they conquered this region. Now what's interesting is that Herod's dad is the one who helped Herod to become king. Herod wasn't born a king. In fact, you've probably seen the Maybelline commercials, right? Maybe they're born with it. Maybe it's Maybelline, right? Yeah. So, listen, Herod wasn't born a king. right? I appreciate that. Thank you. It's just because of my singing. That's all it was, right? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'll never sing again. It's okay. I don't know if I can keep that promise or not. But anyways, so Herod's dad made a really good decision. So after Pompey and Julius Caesar had conquered this region, there began to be this huge struggle between Julius Caesar and Pompey. In fact, everything began to erupt into a civil war because of it. And Julius Caesar began to conquer one area after another inside of the known country of Rome so that he could be a lone dictator of the entire area, so that he could become what we now know as Caesar. In fact, he chased Pompey all the way down into Egypt. And at the time that he got down there, Egypt was in a massive civil war of its own. Between a lady, you ever heard of Cleopatra before? Cleopatra and her brother, Ptolemy the First. And they were having a massive war, and so to try to engender themselves to Julius Caesar, Ptolemy the First captures Pompey, cuts his head off, and presents it to Julius Caesar. And it makes Julius Caesar furious. And he actually joins the other side. He joins Cleopatra's side. And he begins to engage in the war. And he actually is losing the war. He gets himself cornered and is surrounded from all sides. And at that moment, Herod's dad rides in with troops and with allies that were all around that he had built relationships with, and he rescues Julius Caesar. And at that moment, Julius Caesar names him the procurator of all of Judea. He gives him the right to go collect taxes, and he gives him the ability to name governors of both Judea and Galilee. And he names his two sons. So in 47 BC, Herod becomes governor of Galilee. What's interesting is that Herod's career skyrocketed from there. In 43 BC, just 4 years afterwards, his dad was poisoned and died. But that didn't stop Herod. He then became a tetrarch. Now, tetrarch is a really fancy word that says one of four in power. It's literally what it meant, is that there were four people, that you were given a quarter of the power of an area. And so he, along with his brother, both became tetrarchs of Idumea. There were four people that were in power. And then, as a tetrarch, Herod began to use his power. In fact, there was a man, his name was Hezekiah. He was a thief and a robber. And he would go and raid these different cities that were all in Herod's territory. And he would hit caravans that were traveling along the way. And Herod didn't want to have anything to do with this guy. He was so furious at him that when he caught him, he executed him on the spot. The Romans celebrated because part of it was their caravans that had been being raided by this guy. They were excited about this. The Jews were furious because the Jews had a rule that in order to execute anybody, it had to go in front of the Sanhedrin first, which is a ruling body who could then say that this person could die. But since he didn't do that, they were like, you don't care about us, you just care about Rome, which was right. And so they ran Herod out of town. He had to go into exile. And while he was in exile, the entire area erupted into war. You had multiple factions who were all trying to get control. In fact, the previous regime, which is called the Hasmonean dynasty, I don't expect you to remember that. There is a test next week, though, just so you know. The Hasmonean dynasty, they had a guy who he went and recruited a brand new empire that was going from Iraq. He said, why don't you come in? And for the next 4 years, they ruled over this area of Idumea. And Herod saw his moment. He knew the importance of this area for traveling, for goods, for being able to ship things. It was the gateway to get to everything to the east. It was the passageway to get to north and south, unless you were doing things by boat, which you can't do year-round. And so Herod takes off from exile and goes to Rome. And he seeks help from Rome and says, listen, help me to get rid of your problem in my land. And the Senate is so moved by what he says that they give him the title King of the Jews. And they send him back to take care of their problem. They send him with money and with all the troops that he could need. And by 37 BC, he had wiped out all of his competition, brutally murdering them, assassinating them, defeating them in war, whatever it took to get his throne. And Rome was extremely satisfied because Herod was not a gentle ruler. In fact, in order to get those that were around him to support him, he took 15 of the wealthiest people in the area, and he took all of their stuff. He seized it, and he sent it all off to Rome. And he said, the rest of you that have lots of money and resources, if you don't follow me, I'll do the same to you. Can you imagine what they all did? Yeah, they were quick to fall in line. And Herod, though, he didn't want people to hate him. And so, because that they wanted a Hasmonean dynasty, that's who that led them through freedom, he married a woman that was a princess of that dynasty. It was actually his second marriage. So for his first marriage, he just got rid of her, shipped her off, put her into exile, along with his firstborn son. They're both gone. And so he began to have more children. And a few years later, this new wife began to plot his death. Not once, but twice. Twice she plotted for his death. And so he executed her. Came up with a plan to show that she had been unfaithful, that she had had an adulterous relationship, and not only did he execute the man that he accused, but he executed her as well, thinking that that would solve all of his problems. And then he went one step further. He brought back the firstborn son that was in exile to be the heir again. He was like, listen, your mom, she messed up everything for you guys, and so now you're cut out of my will. Now he had 3 sons who hated him, not just one. And you can imagine that each of those sons began to separately plot their revenge on their father. Different attempts on his life. Some of them were thwarted by his own spies who figured things out. Some of them were thwarted because of his sister who figured out the plots. But by the time that we get to this moment when the wise men have shown up, all 3 of those sons have been executed. In fact, Caesar Augustus said this. He said, it is better to be Herod's heis, which means pig, than to be his haios, which means son. How interesting that Caesar Augustus knew about all the things that were going on, and he was like, it's better to be one of the pigs because he doesn't eat pork because he's Jewish, or at least pretending to be Jewish, than it is to be his own son. Wow. So we come to this moment. Most scholars believe that this is in the last year of Herod's life, somewhere around 4 BC. The wise men walk in, and they ask him, where is this son, the new king of the Jews? The title that for the last 30 years, Herod has done everything he can to defend this title. He wasn't going to give this up without a fight. So here was Herod's dilemma. Who is the real king of the Jews? Is it him? Or is it this newborn baby? Now Matthew's telling of this story. I don't think it's about making a villain out of Herod. That's how we look at it, because we see this king who killed all the babies because he was paranoid and he was scared about what was going to happen. But I think really Matthew was highlighting something for us. He's already given us this lineage of who Jesus is and he comes from. And if you were here last week, then you know that he answered this major problem about if Joseph was in the line of David, then how did Jesus get into that same line? And he answers that with this adoption. By the way, Luke also answers it by telling us that Mary is also from the line of David. So we have not only an adoption into the line of David, but we have this already birthright because of being born with Mary. And so we have this title that's been bestowed to him. And now we have to have this recognition from the guy who was the holding title holder, the title holder right now. Herod was king of the Jews. And his attempt to take out the life of Jesus gave credence to who Jesus was. By the way, one of my favorite adversaries that happens in Herod's life is actually Cleopatra. Cleopatra and Herod hated each other for a couple of different reasons. One, they had the same mineral rights, and so they were always fighting over these resources. Two, Cleopatra, from the Ptolemy dynasty, part of her birthright was the area of Idumea. So you can imagine that she wanted to oust Herod as fast as she could so that she could get this area that was supposed to be hers. And obviously we've told you what Herod thinks about that kind of stuff, right? You know what I found incredibly interesting is even though Cleopatra dies in 30 BC, her daughter, also named Cleopatra, by the way, takes over, and her daughter is actually more influential and a better ruler than her mom was. And I had never put all this together, but you know why I think the royal family fled to Egypt? Because Cleopatra would protect them. Because if there was another heir to the throne, if there was somebody different that could usurp Herod's authority, she was going to do everything in her might because of her mom and the feud that they had had and the feud that she had with Herod to try to get rid of it. What an interesting thing. So here it is. Herod wrestled with this question. Who is the real king? His decision, right, was get rid of them all because I am the real king. I think it's interesting, that question. And I think it's especially interesting this time of the year. Right? Because at Christmas time, we have lots of people who begin to talk about who is the king of Christmas. By the way, a lot of you know Christmas means Christ's Mass, right? But it also means Christ's the sent one. That's what that idea of Mass means, is to send. Now, most of us in America, if we were honest, or maybe we asked our kids, right? I read a story about a dad that was talking with his kids, and he was like, hey, whose birthday do we celebrate this time of the year? And the kid looked right back at the dad and said, Santa Claus's birthday! Right? Because lots of times we think that Santa is the king of Christmas. Someone recently pointed out to me that the attributes of God that we give to Santa. You ever noticed this before? Right? There's a song. It says, I told you I wouldn't sing, and here it is. I'm going to do it again right now. It says that he sees you when you're sleeping, right? He knows when you're awake. He knows if you've been good or bad, so be good for goodness sake, right? So what we sing about is we're singing that Santa is all present, all knowing, and he's able to be a judge of right and wrong. Those are godlike qualities, aren't they? I like Santa, though. I like all the things that Santa stands for. But Santa is not God. He's not the king of Christmas. There's only one king of Christmas, and that's Jesus. The real Santa will tell you this every time, that he bows his knee to Jesus, just like everybody else. And in fact, I would go as far as to say this. I think Santa is a symbol of Jesus. Right? I could go into this whole idea of the red suit, right? The red suit represents Christ's blood that he shed for us. We could go into the white trim on it was about the purity not only of Jesus, but that after we're washed in his blood that we are made clean. We could talk about the black boots that it represents that he came down to earth and he got into the dirtiness and the sin that we live in to rescue us. We could talk about all of that and it make a great picture about what Santa points to. But more than anything, what do we know Santa for? We know him for his generosity and his love and his peace and his joy and all things that are of Jesus. And without Jesus, there would be no Santa. And I know this time of the year, lots of families struggle with, how do I do Christmas and Santa and Jesus and all of these things together? And I think the biggest thing to understand is that Santa points us right back to Jesus. Because there's only one king of Christmas. There's only one real king of Christmas. And I really want to ask you one last question. Because like any king that has ever existed, we all have the choice to accept or to reject. You know, I think it's interesting over the last 2 weeks when Mary was faced with her dilemma and her decision came, she chose to accept Jesus. And she chose to worship him as the king. Then you have Joseph. And he chose to acknowledge and to adopt. But Herod made a whole different choice. Instead, Herod refused and rejected to bow his knee to anybody else. Who's king in your life this Christmas? There's the zing, right? Who's king in your life? We like to talk about that this time of the year Jesus came to be Savior of the world, but he didn't just come to be Savior, he came to be King. Not only saves us from our sin, but he asks in return that we bow our knee to him and say, he's the one who's in charge. Herod couldn't do that. So instead, he waged war against Jesus. He lost. He didn't only lose in that moment, but he loses for all of eternity. So for you, is Jesus king of your life? Is Jesus the real king of your life? Have you had a moment where you said, without a shadow of a doubt, I bow my knee to him? Because he's the one who's in charge. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for Herod. Seems like an interesting thing to pray, I'm sure, but God, I thank you for him because he has such a clear message for us. When faced with the dilemma, was he willing to give it all up? Or did he want to try to keep it all for himself? God, your word, the Bible, has told us that if we want to hang on to everything, we're going to lose it all. But if we're willing to lose everything, God, that you'll give us even more. More than we could ever imagine. You know, if that's you, if you're here today and you're like, you know what, maybe I knew Jesus as Savior, but I'm not really so sure that he's king of my life. There's two things that you can do. Number one, at the end of the service, I'll be in the back of the room and be more than happy to talk with you about how to make Jesus the one who's king. So you don't walk away from this Christmas season, which points to him. Everything points to him. and not acknowledge him as your king. Or, if you want on your card, just write the word Jesus down there in the prayer section. In fact, in just a moment, we're going to invite our ushers to come forward, and we're going to take the offering. And really, the first thing that we ask from everybody that's here is that you place your card in the offering. If you've been worshiping with us for a while, then we invite you to give and to be a part of what's going on here, the mission of what we're doing. If you're here for the first time and you're a guest, that's all we ask is just that card. Just place that card in there. Father, I thank you for this time of offering that we're about to take. I know that we're going to continue to sing in some worship and just acknowledging you as the King. I pray that tomorrow when I wake up, that I'll acknowledge you as King. Tuesday when I wake up, that I'll acknowledge you as King. That I would constantly remember that you are the King. You're the King of my life. To give you all of the glory and all of the honor.
Sing hallelujah together. Christ the Savior of the world, He has come. To the highest name of all. Hallelujah. Would you all stand as we sing this chorus? The heavens roar, the angels sing, all glory to our God and King. Oh, night divine, forevermore. Hallelujah. Oh, yeah. A pleasure. Oh, I'm with you, man.
I was like, oh no, we just dropped it.
It's like the most important item in the bag.
Like if anything, I just need that.
Oh, man.
Mary, did you know that your baby
When I started playing it,
would one day walk on water?
Yeah.
Mary, did you know that your baby boy would save our souls and die?
when I use that, it's got to
That your baby boy has come to
gonna be here tomorrow?
I will not. You guys have a, I guess a full team tomorrow.
Yeah.
Are you guys leaving everything set up?
I don't know. I don't think so, but I don't know.
Okay.
I haven't got that far yet.
Gotcha. I'm with you. Nice to meet you, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is, because it's nice to have somebody that knows the music, right?
I was telling Pastor Charles I grew up way down in actually, and we were always from here. So, moved here
they'll do, like, so the acoustic will do that set there at the very beginning.
With all the songs.
Yeah, and so, yeah, yeah, and we'll knock out the tune. The orchestra with that, like when I heard all that, I was like, oh, yeah, we're just leaving it all. Leave it all for a day.
Heck yeah.
Yeah, I know.
You did good today.
Oh,
1% better every.
yeah, that's it. There's nowhere to go but downhill for me.
Yeah, right.
Hey, see you, bro.
If you want to work out, it's with more.
Okay, good.
I'm not doing the 8.
No, I'm not doing it. Yeah, your candy cane. You love it.
Charlie, what little black monster?
What do I do?
She said turn off the black monster.
These up here?
These are.
Oh, they got moved over here.
So they're just on that one plug right there? Yeah.
We're the second one.
We're gonna leave this stuff as an in case we need more water in those.
You don't think